for questions. Let's move on. Part one. I want to make sure we all have a common vocabulary, common way of talking about tests, all right? So in part one, we're going to talk about 3 general types of tests. There's a lot of ways to divide up tests. In fact, if I were to ask a group, what kind of tests are there, people would say probably multiple choice tests, fill in the blank tests. But this approach to what kind of tests, categories there ought to be, looks at it from a different angle. It recognizes that language is the most complex of human behaviors. It also recognizes that testing is a complex process. So when you get to language testing, you now have complexity squared. It's no wonder that there's often confusion when it comes to language testing. In spite of the fact that it's complicated, it's also important. Kirk mentioned accreditation. All the regional accreditation organizations are pressing universities to define their learner outcomes and then be able to measure them. If you haven't been visited recently by an accrediting agency, be prepared, because that's what's coming on the next round. Have you ever thought about this? Can you teach knowledge, skills, or attitudes that you can't measure? Do you think you can? You know, you can debate this topic, but I would then ask the follow-up questions. If you could, or if you think you can teach something that you can't measure, how do you know you've done it? Or how could you prove to someone else, like an accrediting agency, that you've done it? Still, tests are very, very powerful and have significant negative impacts when they're misused. Tests can motivate, but they can also demotivate both teachers and students. They can motivate learners to improve their skills. Gee, I didn't do very well, I need to study harder. They can inform teachers, gee, I better review that topic, or I better give more practice in this area because the students just aren't getting it yet. But inappropriate tests can demotivate both students and teachers. Because of this, we talk about washback. How many have heard the term washback before? Never heard? Some? Yep. Okay. In testing circles, it has maybe a different meaning than I've heard some teenagers use when they're sharing drinks, you know, and passing a cup around or something. It's not spitting back into the glass. It's sounds terrible, doesn't it? But washback is a spin-off effect, sometimes not intended, that comes from your test. Negative impact or washback occurs when educational goals are reduced to those that are most easily measured. Has that ever happened in our society or in our educational system? Look at the kinds of tests that are generally given, and you'll see, gee, more important than finding out whether the person really knows how to use higher order cognitive skills is to give a test that can be scored easily, so you end up with multiple choice tests. And then you get a negative washback that actually can prevent you from attaining your original goals. Testing has a negative washback when it tests things that are different from the course goals. Have you ever taken a course or seen a teacher teach a course on writing where the final exam is a multiple choice test? I have. Have you ever seen grammar tests used as a measure of general ability in the language? Yes, see more heads nodding there. So, what is the student going to study? He's going to study grammar, not use of the language. Of course, we don't want to forget grammar. I think that's what Higgs and Clifford said. Okay. Basing speaking ability on pronunciation alone. You ever seen that? Yeah, there's a commercial test out there that does pretty much that. Okay, testing has a positive impact when it reinforces course objectives, and the tests therefore act as change agents. They motivate improvement, part of the teachers, the students, all involved. Okay, but you can see already, if tests are to have a positive impact, you have to have the right kind of test for the right purpose. Here's my three major types of tests that I want to use as an organizing theme for our discussions today. Achievement, performance, and proficiency. And to help define those, I have the keywords memorized, rehearsed ability, and unrehearsed general ability. Some of you who've been reading the literature might find a different label for this, because John Clark likes to call it pro-achievement. I guess I'd use pro-achievement more, but my spell checker doesn't like it. No, no, actually, I personally prefer the term performance, but John Clark and I are talking pretty much about the same thing when he says pro-achievement and I say performance. Now, another thing about achievement is that it relates to a textbook, a specific textbook or curriculum. The important thing about performance is that everything you're doing in those tests is familiar. It's a familiar setting. You're not looking maybe for a memorized response, but it's a familiar setting, a familiar task for the individual taking the test. Proficiency is broad, general, unrehearsed ability. Okay, and we'll come back to this, these definitions as we move along, because it really helps organize the discussions about what type of test do we want. Okay, here's some common testing purposes. You've experienced probably all of these. Assigning grades in a class. Okay, I need some tests so I can give the students grades that they will believe are fair. Or placing students into a sequence of courses. You're teaching 101, 102, 201, 202, 301. Someone comes in who's been studying at another school, another university. Where do they fit? Selecting an applicant for a job with limited static language requirements. What do I mean by that? Where their job is very predictable. What would that be? A receptionist who gets phone calls and all she has to do is understand who the caller is asking to speak with and transfer the call. Or screening employees for future jobs with broad general language requirements. These are not all the purposes, these are just some that we encounter routinely. Okay, let's come back to that theme again, achievement, performance, and proficiency. And let's review it in terms of three components: the task to be accomplished, the context in which it occurs, and the accuracy expectations. Starting with achievement. What's the task? Repeat, produce, choose from among the right answers. What is the context? Those things that the students have been studying in the textbook or in a specific curriculum. How accurate is the performance, or is the response supposed to be? Well, it depends on the teacher. Some teachers grade leniently, some strictly, some alternately strict and lenient depending on what mood they're in. Okay? Compare that with rehearsed performance. What's the task? Well, it's specific skills. It's an area that is restricted. It's not the whole world, but it's an area that the students are familiar with. Accuracy, situation dependent. Depending on the task at hand, how accurate do you have to be? Well, it depends on the situation. If you're just diverting phone calls or routing phone calls to the right person, gee, what's the implication of making a mistake once in a while and sending it to the wrong person because you misunderstood? No great problem. What if you're also answering phones, but this time it's for the 911 call center. Then suddenly the accuracy goes up, right? Okay, now you see the same column of rehearsed performance here, and let's move over and compare that with proficiency. Instead of specific skills, you're now looking for a wide range of abilities, and we can say real-world abilities. And that completes the shift from textbook to real world. Content or context, focused, restricted, broad, in-depth, variable. You don't know specifically what's coming next. Accuracy, situation dependent, ascending expectations. What does that mean? It means the better you get or the more language you can control, the more accurately you better use it. One of the implications of having good pronunciation and broad lexicon and, for instance, inaccurate usage is that people think you're doing it on purpose. Because someone with that much language should know the culture and should be able to do it accurately, for instance. Okay? All right. Question, thought questions here. What would be the result if students studying the same textbook were tested using tests developed and graded by different teachers? Would they get the same grades? Or can we say, unless tests A and B were asked exactly the same questions, the students would have different responses in those tests, right? I mean, I know teachers who somehow find a way to test only the exceptions in the chapter. Instead, and others who would say, oh, don't worry about the exceptions, I just want to get the central ideas. Those two teachers will have different tests. The students' responses will look greatly different. Then there's another point of departure, and that is, even if the questions were the same, unless the teachers graded using exactly the same criteria, the students' grades are going to be different from one teacher to the next. Is there a problem with that? Not in our society, right? As long as the teacher is king of the classroom. Okay? Now, what would happen if the same students were tested on their rehearsed performance abilities? Now we're moving a little bit away from the textbook and memorization to being able to handle the language in situations similar to the dialogue they learned, but not exactly the same. Okay? And they're being tested by University A and University B. Well, they might pick different performance areas. And if so, then the performance of the same student would be different in those two situations. They also might apply the same standards or different standards. Again, the standardization of teachers' ratings is a task that has not yet been accomplished. All right, what would happen if you compared students' achievement ratings from a teacher with their performance ratings on a university-wide test? Say, I remember when I was supervising the lower division language classes at university, and all of the teachers for the 101 and the 102 decided that we would give the same test for all sections. That was, I think, a very interesting decision because most teachers would not agree to that. But they did, and we gave a university-wide test for all of the sections using that same textbook. Did we get the same results as the students, as the teachers had been getting on their weekly or on their chapter tests? No. In fact, we had one class taught by one teacher where no student got lower than a B. We had another class where no student got higher than a B on the university-wide test. But when they did their overall grades for the year, for the semester, there were just as many A's in the first class as in the second class. Okay? Also, those who can pass an achievement test or a rehearsed performance test may not be able to pass a general unrehearsed proficiency test. Does that make sense? Another thought question. What are the implications of all of this? I think it's useful background as we proceed to talk about what do we want to do in testing. And the point, of course, is we need to know what we want to do. Again, the three major types of tests: achievement, performance, and proficiency. And key words: memorized, rehearsed or familiar, and unrehearsed. Okay, here's my chance to test you. Okay, you got I see most of you have paper and pencil. Okay, get ready to write. And I'm not sure yet whether we'll hand this off to the next person to grade or not, but we'll see. Okay. You can be asked 8 questions about which test would be appropriate for a different testing purpose. And it's simple. It's multiple choice. It's really easy, right? Just recognition. It's an achievement type test, right? Just to note, would it be best to use an achievement, a performance, or a proficiency test for this purpose? Okay? What kind of test would you use after Chapter 3 of a beginning language course? Okay, everybody, we won't make this a test. We'll talk about it. Okay, I hear some people up here in the front of the room saying achievement. The back of the room agree? Yes. Okay. Looks like everybody's agreeing. That ought to be an achievement test. What kind of test would you use to place students into a university sequence of courses? I hear performance. I hear proficiency. Did I hear achievement anywhere? Anybody want to say achievement? Yes, there's some. And all of you are right, depending on the goals of that university's program. If that university says, though, in their catalog that they are going to teach students to develop real-world proficiency, then the test ought to reflect that. If they say, by the end of second semester, you will have mastered 24 chapters of material, go ahead, use achievement.
I would use achievement if different people use different textbooks. Then how would it be fair?
If they had different textbooks. I wonder if I have that question in here. I think I might. If not, we'll make that the 9th question, okay? What kind of test would you use to test students completing a year-long intensive language course? Now, by intensive, I mean at least 4 hours of instruction a day, at least 5 days a week, for at least an academic year, maybe a whole year.
Go back to the goals of the course. Exactly.
What's that?
Go back to the goals of the course.
Go back to the goals of the course. Can you imagine teaching an intensive achievement course for an entire year with, say, 30 hours a week for 50 weeks? 150 hours of achievement? Maybe it could be done. I mean, anything can be done. This would describe a lot of government language courses, and they choose to use proficiency tests for the end of those programs. What kind of test would you use to screen job applicants for a specific job with well-defined repetitive tasks? I hear performance. Performance, because you really don't care what textbook they studied from. You just want to know, can they do this job? Over and over and over again. But notice it says, well-defined repetitive tasks. This can be a problem because there are some jobs that have well-defined repetitive tasks that occur on a regular, highly frequent basis, interspersed with a few unpredictable tasks that are extremely critical. And then you have to say, oops, maybe that's this next situation. What kind of test would you use to select a spokesperson for yourself on a news show with a hostile moderator? Yeah, probably proficiency, because you really don't know which way that moderator is going to take the questioning, right? Maybe the moderator doesn't know him or herself even when it starts. Okay, 6. What kind of test would you use to document employees' abilities in their personnel file, for instance? Okay, I hear proficiency. I wouldn't argue with that, but why do you say proficiency? Depends on the job. Now, if this company only has one job that has to be done and it's very, very defined and well rehearsed, you could do something else. But most companies have jobs that cover a range of activities, and you never know if this person is going to get promoted over time and maybe become a vice president who has to then go become the spokesman on CNN. You know, so for most personnel situations, human resources chooses to record a proficiency capability. Number 7, how would you compare the learning of your students with those of other students using the same textbook? You could do achievement, depending on your own goals. If you wanted to say, as a minimum, we do achievement, but wait a minute, my goals are higher than that, and I want to know if my students are meeting those higher goals, then you could go to performance. And this is kind of like your question. What if they had different textbooks, different experiences? How would you compare them? How would you compare the skills of students in a study abroad program with, quote, regular students? Or in one report that we just had, they called them stay-at-homes. So how do you compare the results of students who have gone on a study abroad program with those who, quote, stayed at home at the university and continued their study there? At this point, I think because the instruction diverges so much, and they're going to be hitting so many different situations in country than would probably be captured in the textbook, I'd probably go with proficiency. Okay, congratulations. We've gotten through part 1. At this point, are there any questions we should capture here on the board so we don't forget them? Anything you'd like to make sure we cover as we move forward? Yes?
You mentioned before that when you're comparing these different tests, you're talking about passing a proficiency test. I was wondering, what does that mean, pass a proficiency?
Good, good. Thank you. What does it mean to pass a proficiency? We will talk about that a little bit, but I think I want to spend some time with it right now. Before I answer, though, that question, what does it mean to pass an achievement test? What is passing on an achievement test?
In terms of grade, in terms of
Well, how well do I have to do? What score do I have to get to pass an achievement test?
We expect if it is intermediate to be ranking intermediate.
Well,
The school's appropriate grade to pass that level.
No, they count materials, what words count, they have got to pass them.
okay, you've identified what's in the chapter, you've designed a test to test what's in the chapter. How do you decide which students pass and which students don't pass? Percentage? What percentage is passing versus not
depends
passing?
on the university.
Sometimes the institutions are not able to pass from 0.07.
Yeah, it depends on the university. Actually, I've not worked at a university that has actually told me what passing is. I know there's a tradition in American public education.
That's
60% would get you a D maybe, which some people consider passing, and 70% C, and 80% A, B, and 90% an A. That happens an awful lot. But wait a minute. A test written by teacher A and a test written by teacher B are not going to be equally difficult. So what's the justification for setting passing at, or a C at 70%? I used to teach a class at the University of Minnesota, 4 teachers on grading. And first class period, I always had fun because I'd ask them what score they'd like to set for being passing for themselves in that class. And they'd invariably say 70, 80, 90, and I'd say, if you want to, okay, but you need to know the average grade in this class the last time I taught it was 42. Oh, wait a minute, how can that be? Well, because there's only 60 points possible and I don't do percentages. Oh, well, or I have another way of grading. You know, it's all arbitrary. When we say passing on an achievement test is a certain level, it's our own experience, it's a custom. Actually, think about this. Say you wanted to set 80% at passing, and you get 80% on chapter 1, and then you go to chapter 2, and passing is even 80%. But the students are now expected to combine chapters 1 and 2. What is 80% of 80%? 64%. So it is possible for students to move along, and by the time you get a third chapter at 80%, you're now at about 50% workability with all the information that has been taught, if you're going strictly achievement. Grading is fun, right? There's a great book, I don't think it's in print anymore, but it's called Assigning Grades to Students. And I recommend it if you can find it anywhere. Now, the grading we've just been talking about has been percentage. There's another very common grading system. Pardon? Criterion reference, I was going to save that for third. I'm going to hit one right in the middle. You're just too smart. Okay. The other category of grading would be norm referenced. And that contrasts with criterion referenced. Norm referenced grading is very, very often used on major exams, midterms, finals. What's the basis for norm reference? Do you know where the name came from? The norm, yeah, the student in the class named Norman. No, it's norm referenced is comparing a student against all the other students. And then that usually works something like this. The teacher says, gee, I'm going to give up to 20% of my students an A. So what score determines an A really depends on how all the students did, not on how the top students did alone. And so you compare these students against the whole range of students, and you say, okay, here's the top 20%, we'll give them A. So you've got percentage correct, you've got norm referenced, and then you've got criterion referenced. When we get into proficiency testing, one of the distinguishing features of proficiency testing versus other tests is that it's criterion referenced. Everybody can get an A if they meet the criterion. Okay, I think that's enough for now, and I'm sure we'll come back to it.